I didn't have a gun, so I bought a bottle of champagne. How am I dressed?
You look beautiful.
Look at me. I grew out of my black suits because I became a fat f***. Today I'm reacting to the watches worn by 007 James Bond. The James Bond special.
Are you a James Bond fan?
You know what? When I was a kid, I loved James Bond, but for me, there's only one James Bond person.
Who?
Pierce Brosnan.
Pierce Brosnan?
Bosman?
Brosnan.
Oh, Brosnan.
You know he's from like an hour and a half from where we are, in Drogheda.
Is he an Irish cunt? I didn't know. That's class. Pierce Brosnan was my James Bond. And ever since Daniel Craig became the James Bond, I haven't watched... What is his name now?
Daniel Craig.
Whenever Daniel Craig became James Bond, I wasn't interested anymore. I watched Spectre, right? And the only reason why I watched Spectre was because the bad guy in Spectre was the guy from Inglourious Bastards.
Oh yeah, Christoph Waltz.
Ooh, that's a bingo.
Exactly.
Love that guy.
So I watched James Bond just for the bad guy. Am I a James Bond fan? No. I'm a James Bond fan of his watches. I have no clue.
I admire your courage, Miss...
Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Is Dr. No the first ever James Bond?
Yeah.
I remember me playing a video game on a Nintendo 64 called GoldenEye. In class, boy.
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
The first watch James Bond ever wore was an American brand called Gruen. In the movie, Dr. No. The watch James Bond is wearing here is the Gruen Precision reference number 510. The Gruen Precision is a small 34mm gold-plated watch with a manual wound movement. This watch was massively popular in the mid and late 50s. That watch is not a James Bond worthy watch. It's a gold-plated watch. It's James Bond. It's the coolest man alive. It's the dangerous man alive. And he rocks around with an American piece of shit. The good thing is, you want to feel like James Bond and buy exactly that watch? You can do that because the watch is worth between $250 and $350.
That explains.
Explains what?
Why you need a taxi.
Why I need a taxi?
Careful, my nail varnish.
Oh, that's nice. The woman and the watch as well. Like, I mean, the woman is like God tier. You know what that is? The most iconic, most important watch of the Rolex line ever. Of course, it's the Rolex Submariner. But this is the Rolex Submariner that we refer to as the Big Crown. This is the reference number 6538. Ladies and gentlemen, I've only seen 3 really good ones in real life.
What do you mean really good ones?
So really good ones is like in original condition, not f***ed with, not iced out. Can you imagine icing this out? Like, I swear, the Migos that will buy this and ice it out. This is like horological history. This is importance. This is like a Rembrandt painting. This is a watch that was only in production for 4 years between 1955 and 1959. A watch that we refer to as watch collectors as the Big Crown, the Rolex Submariner Big Crown, or the Rolex Submariner Dr. No. When you look at the watch, you see no crown guards next to the crown. That was standard back in the day. But it also caused problems. A crown can break. It's a fragile part of the watch. Therefore, in later generations, a crown guard was introduced. But this one still has that one big crown. It's very, very difficult to value this watch. But if you're looking for a 6538, be prepared to pay at least $60,000. Now comes the thing. If you want a period correct one, if you want everything to be 100%, be ready to pay at least $250,000. And if you're then looking for a watch that has also papers, be prepared to pay at least $500,000. This exact Rolex Submariner was also used in the following 2 movies. From Russia with Love and Goldfinger. Who is your favorite James Bond?
Probably Daniel Craig, just because I've grown up watching his films.
F*** me, I grew up with Pierce Brosnan. Look at him. He looks like James Bond, like.
Have you seen Mamma Mia?
No.
He's in Mamma Mia.
Why is James Bond in Mamma Mia?
Have you heard him singing before?
No.
Where are those happy days? They seem so hard to find.
I wish I never seen that. 6538 Rolex Submariner. I love that watch. You know how big that watch is? Take a guess.
42 millimeters.
You couldn't be further from the truth. A Submariner is 40 millimeters nowadays, but this watch is 37 millimeters. 42 millimeters? What the f are you talking about?
What are you wearing, your wrist?
This is the GShock Casio Oak by IFL Watches. This is a collaboration between IFL Watches and the Dow artist. This is hand painted and handmade, painted in the rainbow colors by the one and only Dow artist. From the bezel to the indexes to the hands. The previous version of this watch was sold out within 4 days. That's bonkers. And I'm so glad to have one because this watch was actually sold out for 2 months. It's class. Love it. The Casio Oak Rainbow by IFL Watches. To make sure that you don't miss out, click the first link in the description to buy your own hand-painted God tier watch. This is God tier.
Here we have a Geiger counter. Useful and unobtrusive.
That's probably Breitling's most disgusting watch ever created. What you see here is the Breitling Top Time reference number 2002. You rarely ever see this watch. You know what a Geiger counter is? A Geiger counter would measure the radioactivity of an object. You know what I have here? I have a watch that is actually radioactive loaded. Want to see it?
Yeah.
Let me share you a quick story about radioactive material. What you see here is a Rolex dating back at 1921. A watch that is loaded with radium, a radioactive material, a very dangerous material. And radioactive material was very, very popular for watches. Anything before the 50s, watchmakers were using radium to lume the watches to make sure that people were able to see the time in the dark. People didn't know back in the day that radium was a very dangerous material. At a workshop of a watchmaker, there was a table of ladies painting the dials with radium. They painted the hands and they painted the numerals. Painted it on, licked it clean, put it in, painted it. And then people realized that radium was actually a really dangerous material. The ladies that done that painted the dials, all died. And that is where people realized how dangerous radium actually was. Watches actually killed people because of that. At a later stage, and you see this starting in and around the 60s, the watchmakers started to use tritium instead of radium, which was a less dangerous material, still radioactive. And then in the late 90s, every single watchmaker moved away from radioactive material and started to use paint called superluminova or luminova. People died by making watches.
Did someone die making that watch?
Yeah, probably, because this is actually loaded radium. So this is painted radium. One of my favorite ever watches in the movie Thunderball.
Thunderball?
Thunderball.
Thunderball.
The movie Thunderball, the Breitling Navy Timer 806. You know that this is actually one of the most important ever navigation tools for pilots created on a wrist. Breitling was unbelievable back in the day. Breitling was together with Longines one of the most important players in making chronographs, which allowed pilots to proper navigate. And the most famous Breitling Navy Timer was the Breitling Navy Timer reference number 806. If you want to buy an original vintage Breitling Navy Timer 806, you need to be ready to pay between $8,000 and $10,000. I think it's more than worth it. What you see here is the Rolex Submariner 5513. The 5513 is what I believe the original... The Rolex Submariner reference number 5513 is what I believe the longest running reference number that Rolex has ever produced. This watch was in production for a whooping 27 years. This watch was first produced in 1962. It was in production till 1989. In the 27 years, there were a few minor changes on the dial, but the case, the bezel, and everything else always stayed the same. For me personally, the Rolex 5513 is the perfect Rolex Submariner. You can buy a Rolex Submariner 5513 starting from about $8,000 for a watch only in a bit of a rough condition. If you want the best of the best, you need to be ready to pay at least $80,000 to $150,000. This is actually a chronograph Rolex that was produced before the Rolex Daytona was called the Rolex Daytona. Reference number 6239 was the first ever Rolex Daytona and was introduced in 1963. This is a reference number 6238. This is what we call the pre-Daytona Daytona. It's class. If you want to buy a really, really nice 6238, you need to be able to spend $50,000 at least. Where if you want to buy a really, really good 6239, which is the first generation of the Daytona, you need to be ready to spend at least $80,000. This is actually a really cool watch, the Hamilton Pulsar. One of the first mass-produced digital watches ever. Hamilton was actually an American brand that during the introduction of this watch moved to Switzerland. This is the Hamilton Pulsar P2. If you look well enough, you can still find this watch somewhere floating around on the internet. And you can buy that between $600 and $800. Can you imagine? The other boys all wear Rolexes and he gets this piece of shit. Listen mate, I'm not gonna lie, but I have work to do.
Should we do a part 2 then?
Yeah, hell, I'm not gonna sit here any longer. This is ridiculous, mate. I have work to do. I'm gonna do a part 2 next week. I promise. You know what we call the gold finger?
What?
Is when you were meeting a girl for the first time and you put her finger in her, and then you take it out, and that was a gold finger. That's what we call the gold finger. This was when we were young, like when we were like experimenting and stuff.